Good afternoon from Beijing. My name is Carlos Rockbelns. I'm the Euraxis China country representative. I am delighted to welcome you to the Euraxis China, Japan, and Korea joint webinar on sustainability and clean energy in international cooperation. We are taking this hour and a half to discuss research collaborations in Asia, between Asia and Europe, research that is focused on climate change, and the solutions being devised to address the climate crisis. We want to highlight the existing collaborations and the role that European research funding through the Horizon Europe framework is supporting this cutting-edge research and solutions for the climate crisis. Joining me from China, later we'll hear a presentation from Dr. Benjamin Lafitte, who works on the climate cycle research.
I guess it's my clue to take over. I'm Judith Erika Magyar, country representative in Tokyo for Euraxis Japan, and a very warm welcome to all of you in Europe and also in Asia. Today, we are going to take, as my colleague said, 90 minutes to focus on clean energy and sustainability. And I would like to ask you to submit your queries, should you have any, to the speakers in the Q&A box, not in the chat. Let me welcome Ms. Rosita Zilli, Policy Director of the European Energy Research Alliance in Brussels, who will deliver the opening speech in a few minutes. And I would like to hand over to my colleague, Tomasz Wierzbowski. Tomasz?
Good afternoon, everyone. Although I have certain problems with my camera, I'm very happy to talk to all of you. I hope you can hear me. Maybe you cannot see me. I'm based in Seoul. I do a similar job to Judith and Carlis, with only difference that Korea has become associated to Horizon Europe last year, which makes much easier to collaborate between Korean partners and European counterparts. And the aim of this webinar, as it was mentioned, is to talk and search for solutions in sustainable and clean energy. Later on, I will pass the floor to Professor Zeliger, who is a professor at Hallym University, and at the same time, he has been a representative for Hans Seidel Foundation in Korea for the last 23 years, and he has been involved in many international collaboration projects regarding climate change, sustainable energy in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz. Again, the floor is mine. And with that, I would like to invite the opening speaker, Ms. Rosita Zilli, Policy Director at the European Energy Research Alliance. ERA is Europe's largest low-carbon energy research community. In this capacity, she is responsible for analyzing and shaping strategies related to EU and international policies and regulations linked to the clean energy transition, providing strategic guidance on ERA's positioning and contributing to the definition of long-term policy priorities. Prior to that, she served as Deputy Secretary General at Eurocoup, the European Community of Consumer Cooperatives, and worked in the field of international cooperation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Currently based in Brussels, Rosita Zilli holds a degree in International Affairs and Diplomacy from the University of Trieste, Italy. Ms. Zilli, the floor is yours. Thank you.
It's perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Judith. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are connecting to this webinar. So a warm welcome also from my side. And thank you for having invited me to deliver this opening speech touching upon the sustainability and clean energy scene in Europe, especially as far as Horizon Europe and the European Commission policies are concerned on these issues. As Judith was saying, I'm Policy Director at ERA, European Energy Research Alliance. We bring together 250 leading organizations, mainly universities and RTOs, across more than 30 countries in Europe. So I will start with the general setting the scene, touching upon the novelties which are more of interest to our community of this new EU mandate, the new European Commission, European Parliament setup that we have, and also, of course, the changes which are of interest to the Council. We're in a different setting, in a quite different setting since the last mandate, which terminated last year. So now we are in a new EU institutional framework, which differentiates from the one before, has been much more polarized, much more fragmented. And we have seen also the emergence of several different mantras guiding policy action as far as the clean energy transition is concerned. For example, of course, we have identified a few key mantras, as we call them, which guide policy and political action at European institutional level. And of course, the first one is competitiveness. It is something which has been coming since a few years already, and many of you may recall the Draghi report on European competitiveness, which is still a report which is highly influential on the EU political and policy scene. And then, of course, all the drive towards simplification, diversification, which I think is particularly interesting and relevant for the discussions we are having here today. Strategic autonomy, or even under the new work program of the Commission for next year, even independence. It has been called Europe's independence moment. And of course, everything which is which turns around the key concept of resilience. What does it mean for energy? For energy, all this translates into the need to step up efforts as far as security of supply is concerned, affordability, and of course, diversification, which means diversification of suppliers. We know the difficulties we have now for China regarding critical raw materials, for example, and at the same time also the need to step up clean tech in Europe. And here we have two big policy files, which are the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. Something with which our community grapples a lot is the European Green Deal. We've been asked many times, what about the European Green Deal? And our understanding is that, and what we also mirror back to our community, is that the European Green Deal is still there, is still there mostly from a legislative and regulatory point of view, but politically is sailing towards troubled waters. So we would say that politically is much weaker than it was, of course, in the previous term. And that we see that it is relevant as only insofar as it connects to the mantras I've been mentioning earlier on. So competitiveness, simplification, diversification, strategic autonomy, resilience, because everything which is more related to climate, to nature, to biodiversity, we see it much more deprioritized under this new EU institutional term. For our community, we are a research and innovation community, and we see there's a lot of emphasis on the contribution that research and innovation can offer to tackle all the challenges the EU is facing. So in a way, it's a bit of a research and innovation momentum. So we're very glad of that. Of course, although sometimes we feel that research and innovation is felt as a silver bullet, and it's not, and of course, it's not exactly that. For the main files, we have under our radar, of course, the Competitiveness Compass, which has been the equivalent, I would say, of the European Green Deal of the previous term. Then, of course, we are the importance of the Clean Industrial Deal, which is referred as a business plan. So a lot of change also here in the terminology used in the new mandate of the European Commission. We are speaking about business plans. We're speaking about growth strategies. This is really a big change in comparison to the previous EU institutional term. Then we have the action plan for affordable energies. All these policy files are really the constellation on which our community is moving within this new term. Of course, we will be very much looking into the Clean Industrial Deal implementation, Clean Energy Investment Strategy, EU Grids Package, all these files which have been announced also by President von der Leyen in her State of the Union in September this year. Very interesting also for this webinar, I think, are all the discussions on climate. It was mentioned at the beginning about climate change or climate catastrophe. We see that the European Commission is stepping back a lot on climate diplomacy. There have been all the difficulties in agreeing the 2040 climate target. We have seen now the difficulties in coming up with the 2035 national determined contribution for Belém for COP30. So this is something which we are monitoring very, very closely. On the international stage, I've touched upon briefly already a lot of difficulties. We have more tense relationship with the US and everything which you will surely know about the US trade agreement, which has a lot of implications for energy. We have the China's restrictions on critical raw materials. This is something on which the European Commission is working steadily because, as of course, they are key to carry out the clean energy transition. And of course, diversification means a lot also in terms of framework programming of research and innovation. For example, we have seen only this year the association to Horizon Europe by Egypt, by South Korea, or Republic of Korea. It's called in the two manners. We have the Japan moving towards association, exploratory talks with Australia, so a lot of diversification in that respect as well. And also recently the European Commission launched the Pact for the Mediterranean. So also a lot of interest with the southern shore of the Mediterranean for all kinds of cooperation, including research and innovation. Not to forget Science for Europe, of course, to attract and retain international talent. This was mostly in a reaction to everything what is happening in the United States, but not only. So it is a policy to attract international talent to the European Union. And as I mentioned, everything which relates to the diversification of supplies, especially critical raw materials, and also the need to increase homegrown production of clean tech. And for that we have the Net Zero Industry Act, which is the leading policy in this field. I will close with a mention to the multi-annual financial framework. The proposal has been put on the table on the 16th of July. Now it's entering negotiations with the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. For ERA, this will be one of the main files which will keep us busy. It is an envelope of 1.8 trillion euros, global envelope of 1.8 trillion euros, which represents a 50% increase in real terms in comparison to the MFF, which stands now, the 2021-2027. 35% of the budget is earmarked in support of climate and environmental action. This, we found it as a very good tenet, although, of course, we have seen that, for example, the LIFE program is not self-standing any longer. So it is another pointer in the direction of the deprioritization of the new EU institutional term of nature and biodiversity. Within the MFF, of course, for research and innovation, the main focus will be on this new animal in town, I would say, the European Competitiveness Fund, 409 billion euros there, and within it, the new Horizon Europe, so the FP10, it will still be called Horizon Europe. So Horizon Europe Reloaded or 2.0. We were very happy to see that 170 billion euros are put on the table for that. Of course, this is much more than we have under the current Horizon Europe program, although it still falls short of the 200 and 220 billion which were asked by the research community and which were also put forward, for example, by the A2 report and by the Draghi report. For us, it will be a matter to see how the interplay between the FP10 and the European Competitiveness Fund will be sorted out, especially as far as the Pillar 2 and the policy windows in the European Competitiveness Fund is concerned. And I will just conclude on mentioning Pillar 2. So the new Horizon Europe will still have pillars, one more than the Horizon Europe which we have, on which we are operating now. And for us, it will be very important to see that Pillar 2, which is collaborative research, still has the space it deserves. It's still the biggest budget within the new Horizon Europe, but we see a lot of emphasis towards high TRLs, towards low TRLs, and of course, the middle TRLs, the collaborative research needs to be adequately funded for the innovation funnel not to dry out. So this is a bit the constellation on which we are moving at the moment, and also the policy and the research and innovation funding, which we are closely monitoring and looking at for now and for the next months and years. And with that, I will close my intervention. And of course, I'm very happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the opening speech. Much appreciated. And we would like to also mention that Japan is about to be associated to Horizon Europe Pillar 2, similar to Korea. We are very much looking forward to the developments in this regard. And we hope that this will also foster collaboration between the EU and Japan further. Those of you who are interested in any of the calls, please have a look at the Main Horizon website and the dashboard for inspiration for past projects. And should you need any further information, you're welcome to reach out to any of the country representatives present today.
Also, a big thank you from me to Ms. Zilli for providing that overview of what is going on in energy research in Europe. That is very, very useful and insightful. But now we are moving to the spiciest part of China, Sichuan, also famous for its pandas. Dr. Benjamin Lafitte, who is currently doing a postdoctoral research at Chengdu University of Technology, is based there, and he's coming in live from there. He will present his research currently done at Chengdu University, but he is a long-term Sichuan person. He obtained his PhD at Sichuan University and did his field work on CO2 absorption by trees, also in the mountains of Sichuan. Dr. Lafitte, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, thank you everybody for the invitation. I'm sure this is going to be a very great and successful webinar. Thank you to all the EURAXESS members for the invitation. So let's start. So it's going to be a very basic, and I'm going to try to be as clear as possible because my field of research now is a bit linked to mathematics and modeling, but I'm going to try to just give you a view of the surface of what we're doing in Chengdu University of Technology. So I call this discussion the path ahead and predicting carbon and future climates. So we're basically working on all the modeling part, especially the soil. And why do you think soil matters? First, soil is a very precious mixture of whatever is living, including arthropod, micro biodiversity, including fungi and bacteria, but also the never living and the dead. And it's, as you may know, a vital resource for 98.8% of our food. But also, and most importantly, soil is very important in regulating carbon cycle because it can store more than two-thirds of the Earth terrestrial carbon. This is actually more than the carbon contained in vegetation, but also the atmosphere combined. So here I'm going to talk first about what we're doing, especially how to predict this soil respiration, which I will define shortly. And then I will talk about another project that we have also in collaboration with the CEAA in France, and especially the Laboratory for Climate Change close to Paris with Professor Philippe Siès, which is also a member of the IPCC. And I will talk about what is the role of the biodiversity for the carbon cycle, which is a part that is most of the time not really mentioned. And last time, I would just give you a brief talk about the scenarios for future climate and why our study is important for the scenarios. So first, how to predict soil respiration. So soil respiration is a very well-known concept now, which is actually the part of the carbon that is released from the soil. So we're not talking here about the anthropogenic carbon, the human emission carbon, but this is a natural phenomenon of the carbon that is released from the soil caused by different part like the respiration from the microbes, but also the respiration from the roots and the vegetation. Um, and this carbon respiration is actually the second largest carbon flux between the land and the atmosphere, just after the photosynthesis, which is kind of the opposite, which is all the carbon taken from the atmosphere to the soil. So the main question here, and the main question we try to understand for our research is, do we have a carbon sink right now on land, or do we have a carbon source? So this is a very, very important and question, especially because we know at some places we can store more carbon than we emit. But because of climate change, of course, and the warming of the soil, sometimes we have a carbon source, means more carbon is emitted from the soil that is actually stored by the trees. So what we need now is we need some accurate estimates of soil respiration and also try to better understand the drivers of this soil respiration. And this is going to be helpful actually to better predict future climate and include this new data of soil respiration into our new modeling frameworks. So modeling is actually very challenging. So this is a kind of scientific papers that you can find in the research community on climate change. Some says models are not complicated enough. We need to increase the model complexity, or some others we say we compare some models to our new data, but they're all wrong. So it's always a challenge to find competitive and also contradictive, because all the new research right now are always contradictive, and we're not sure where the carbon actually is. So even in the top scientific journals, sometimes you can find a paper published 1 month after saying, oh, this last study is wrong. So the main reason is we're doing this job is because all the previous study that tried to work on this carbon respiration didn't find any consensus. So as you can see on this graph here, the soil respiration that you have, let me get a pointer. The last carbon respiration that was published was around 2022. And you can see the very, very large range of estimates in petagram carbon. So we're still not sure how much actually is emitted from the soil. And most of these studies actually use something called empirical models based on basic linear models and basic data. But more recently, we've been trying to use data-driven machine learning models. And especially here, what we do is deep learning. So deep learning is actually used in a lot of things you do every day, but this deep learning model is actually based on a lot of data, big data that we use from, for example, the data from the NASA or data from the Copernicus. So we use data from American and European sources. And we actually use a model called MLP. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's actually a deep learning framework that allow you to use those data and put them together to actually generate what is the soil respiration across the globe. And to do so, we collected a lot of data around the globe that are actually observed data of soil respiration. And we put them together with environmental variables that I talked about for data from NASA, like, for example, temperature or precipitation, and some more demographic data, and also some vegetation information, for example, the net primary productivity or gross primary productivity, also the leaf area of trees, etc., etc. And then we can build our deep learning model that is actually allowing us to predict spatially and also temporally um, soil respiration at a global scale. And this is a paper we published recently in Global Change Biology with the European researcher, Philippe Sies. And we also try to find which are the drivers of this soil respiration. And as you can see here, we have a map with a triangle. So green is for vegetation, red is for temperature, and blue is for precipitation. So we can better understand, especially what are the drivers or of these emissions. So this is a very interesting map because now we know, like in some areas, for example, in Europe, the main driver that causes this carbon to be released from the soil into the atmosphere is basically temperature. And this is the case for most of the northern, I would say, northern latitude region and areas. Okay, so this was the first part of what we're doing, and more recently we've been working on biodiversity because this is maybe a even more complex challenge than the climate change or CO2. And I would like to start with a assessment of the current situation. So some researchers, they call this the two-third crisis because in few years we lost more than two-thirds of our insects globally. And in few decades, we lost more than two-thirds of the wild mammals. And in 1,000 years, we lost nearly two-thirds of the plants. And this is not mainly the consequence of climate change. This is mainly caused by human activities and also the artificialization of the land. But biodiversity is, and especially we're going to focus on the plants. So you might know maybe that plant diversity loss can reduce the carbon storage. Of course, if you cut trees, less carbon will be absorbed. So there's a good news is if you increase plant diversity, you can also increase carbon storage. And this is coming from a very recent publication in Nature last year. But the bad news is there is a negative feedback loop, which means that higher levels of climate change will also increase the biodiversity loss. And this biodiversity loss will also increase carbon emissions, which in turn will give more climate change. So you have the good news and the bad news. But the plant biodiversity conservation and restoration right now can and maybe could help achieve climate change mitigation goals. So it's also very important, like I said before, to understand better the cycle through soil respiration, but it's also very important to understand the link between biodiversity and the soil respiration. And this is what we're doing now. So this is work that is under review in Nature Communication right now. And we found actually a positive link between soil respiration and biodiversity, especially plant species richness. So It's actually a very complex positive effect because it also depends on the productivity of the forest. But I'm not going to go into the details. I just wanted to share with you that it's very important also to take into account the biodiversity to predict climate change and to predict carbon emissions. Um, this is the last part. I would like to talk about the scenarios for the future. And this is something that you might have seen maybe if you read AR6, which is the report from IPCC and six ones. And let's start with a very short definition and why actually scientists use different pathway to understand carbon and climate in the future. So the purpose is to explore different futures by modeling how different human actions and policy choices could shape our environments. So this is what we call the SSPs, and SSPs are actually based on different social economic pathways, including GDP, including poverty, including development of new developing countries, etc. And this is basically useful for scientists, but also policymakers and environmental planners. And what do we do this is actually because it can help very important questions like what will happen if we prioritize sustainability, or what if we continue on our current development path without addressing carbon emissions. So I'm sure this is something you're very familiar with. So I give you a very simplified illustration of the scenario generation process. So this is actually what we do. We try to improve this emission scenario here, including the soil respiration and more accurate soil respiration prediction. So those are to build some social and economic models. And these social economic models will actually be included into something called Earth system models that are very complicated models that are actually calculated through very powerful computers. And this gives you actually a better efficient estimation of all the concentration of the greenhouse gases, but also the climate projection. And lastly, these Earth system models actually help us to understand more geophysical impact models or ecosystem and biodiversity models to understand, for example, the species level and how human is actually impacting species or diversity in plants or even animals as well. But it also can be very useful to understand all the complex geophysical models like the ocean, sea level, for example, and also some others like coastal erosion or wildlife modeling. So the projection of these CO2 emissions is actually calculated according to the five IPCC scenarios. And as you can see, the blue here is actually the more sustainable. And I'm sure, again, you have seen this graph before. Then you have intermediate level that they call middle of the road. More regional rivalry. So this is some countries that still fight for example, GDP, or that disagree with some economical agreements and economical partnerships. And then you have the last one called the fossil fuel development. So this is the worst scenario you can see. And this is so the emissions that are calculated from the IPCC. But again, those emissions might be biased by some mistakes they've made in the assessment of soil respiration. So these scenarios also allow researchers to understand the future temperature in degrees that you have in the y-axis here. Again, the temperature right now is increasing, whatever the level, whatever the scenario you're choosing. And this increase is planned for the next 20 years, whatever we do. But this is after those 20 years that we might see a change in the temperature that we're going to reach. So another thing that is done with the IPCC is, for example, projecting the average sea level rise. And as you can see on this graph, whatever the scenario you take, all scenarios show an increase in sea level. So this increase is going to be more a little bit more slow, a bit slower, or a bit faster. But whatever the scenario we're going to take is going to be increasing by at least a little bit more than half a meter. So lastly, the special temperatures for global warming are also calculated for every increments. So here you can see a word of 1.5 degree warming. And this is a map that we've done with a word for 2 degrees warming. And as you can see, the regions that are going to be the most affected are the high latitude region. And this is the for the worst scenario. And as you can see again, the highest increase in temperature will be for the high latitude region, including a big part of North America and also Europe. And these regional changes in mean climates and extremes will become more widespread and pronounced. So it's not only the temperature that will increase, it's the frequency of the extremes. So that's a very important, actually, contrast. And this is a slide that I like to share for during conferences or webinar. And this is the question that we always wonder, a few degrees more, does it really matter? So here on the left side, this is a map of Europe 20,000 years ago. And as you can see, Northern Europe has a 3 kilometer thick ice cap. And most of Europe is actually what we found in the Siberian uh, desert and maybe some boreal areas with some dry steppe here in Spain and South Europe, Italy, Greece, and some tundra in Central Europe. And this is Europe today. So as you can see, we have a cool temperate forest climate. In red here, you have a Mediterranean climate, which is a very nice climate for now. And my question is, how many degrees in mean, actually mean average global temperature is the difference between those 20,000 years and Europe today? So what is the difference in degrees for the average mean temperature around the globe? And it might sound like it's a lot, but this is actually only 5 degrees. So 3 take-home messages from what we do and what we need to do next. The first one is understanding soil respiration is very key for future model projection because this soil respiration is a very complex process that is still studied right now. And this is going to play a really critical role in the global carbon cycle. And also this will impact how we see the future climate. And it's very important because we still don't fully understand it. My take-home message number 2 will be that biodiversity is also very important and matters a lot for future climate. And this is something that is always not clearly seen by a lot of scientific communities because we see biodiversity as something we need to protect, but it is also a very important matter for climate change. And my last take-home message will be that our choices shape our future. And even though we know these SSPs can be maybe a way to follow for our future, it really depends on our collective actions. So we need to make some more informed choices and protect also our natural forest. And this can influence actually those predictive way to see how climate will be in the future. Even though it doesn't sound really good right now, I'm sure these studies can help us improve actually those scenarios and let's say be a little bit more positive on the future. And I think that will be all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lafitte, for your very interesting presentation. This opportunity to learn about your research, which is clearly impactful as we look at the your publication record. It's also very important to note that you are working in China as a French researcher. It's an important example of transboundary transnational research, which is great to see. With that, I am handing over the floor to our colleagues in Korea.
Thank you very much, Carlis. Thank you very much, Dr. Lafayette, for your very insightful but difficult to understand to follow presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Seliger from Halle University. In his capacity as a Hans Seidel Foundation representative, he has implemented multiple projects, especially in capacity building, in forestry, biodiversity, renewable energy, and clean development mechanism in various parts of the Korean Peninsula, let me say. Dr. Seliger, the floor is yours.
As we talk here now, in Gyeongju in Korea, there's the APEC summit. And I was reminded of that when I heard the introductory words, because at that summit, where the heads of government of Japan, Korea, and China are, there's almost no talk about climate change at all. So also in the region here, it became much less important than in past. And what I want to do is to give you a very short overview over climate change and energy policy issues in Korea. It's a non-scientific overview, really. I wish I could go down here, click me through the paper. Okay. So the first thing what I want to say is Korea give you an introduction, but okay. Let's have a look at Korea's clean energy sector. We have a very low part of renewables in total power generation of 8 to 9%. There's a goal to reach 21% by 2030, but it's very, very difficult to see how this can come about because we have very strong priorities here for growth and for cheap energy. You see here some key institutions, some key projects, which I will not have the time to go through. It's important to see that the largest renewable source is solar power. There's a lot of wind power projects starting now, but we see already that we'll get into trouble, and that refers a little to the last presentation with biodiversity concerns. We have concerns with migratory birds. We have concerns with offshore production in sensitive maritime ecological contexts. So that will be very difficult to enlarge a lot. We have hydropower to a very small extent, and bioenergy, it will be a little bit growing, but also both of these will not be major sources of clean energy in the future. So really solar power plus more wind power in the future will be the main sources of clean energy. As I said, we have a problem that we have this priority for growth, which means also that we have what economists would call really a form of misallocation. We have, for example, no oil here or no gas here, but we have a very large petrochemical sector because we have very cheap energy, and cheap energy for industry and consumers remains important. There's a second problem, namely the change of government often brings completely new policy priorities. And we saw it from last year to this year. The last government said we need 100% nuclear power production to achieve carbon-free, emission-free growth. And this government now, which we have now, they again switch to what they call clean energy, that is solar and wind power. The first government which introduced strong green policies was the government of Lee Myung-bak, a conservative government, slightly surprising maybe, but they had it really in the context of growth policies, and they strongly pushed for the Global Green Growth Institute, which was first a private institute and then became really in a record time of only 2 years an international institution with today 30 member states. Many researchers saw that as a form of greenwashing or a form of green diplomacy, which had few to do with really clean energy policy. That is, so to speak, on the meta level or on the institutional level. The next is then we have a clean energy policy as a peer-to-peer policy. That is, Korea is very strong in benchmarking. They always have been. They send out delegations everywhere in the world to benchmark good policies. And one of the efforts there is a German-Korean energy partnership, which is there to accelerate renewable expansion and system integration, and especially focusing in the moment on green hydrogen production, transport, and storage, plus to a much smaller extent energy efficiency. That's something the Germans are pushing for, but much less the Koreans, which is working with committees, technical exchanges, and knowledge sharing. We have these meetings going on, and we have a technical roadmap and pilot projects in one field especially, and that is the field of hydrogen, plus bilateral events promoting discussions on renewables and hydrogen. For example, here are some examples: climate conferences, committee meetings, energy days. That is more something related to awareness raising. These are good projects, but the outcomes are very, very questionable also. Besides that, there's some knowledge transfer, which is good, and which I think Araxes would be happy about, because it also goes into both directions, really. We have very few tangible outcomes. It would be really important to translate the policy dialogue, which has been established, into pilot projects, which then can be scaled up, and to deepen the industry partnership. But there we are very weak still. And while in the past, the German side pushed a lot for that, now also in Germany, green policies became much less of a preoccupation. So I really don't see there's a very big future for this kind of peer-to-peer cooperation. Finally, we have something else, and that is a clean energy developmental approach. And that, again, closely links to what we saw before with the establishment of the Green Growth Institute. Korea is very good to sell the few things they do actually on clean energy, and KOICA is one of the institutions. It's a Korean International Cooperation Agency, which is now quite a major donor internationally, and they support sustainable energy transition in developing countries. That's part of Korea's what they call the Green New Deal and ODA policy, to focus on climate resilience, low carbon development, renewable energy access, and capacity building. And we have a lot of projects, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa on mini grids and solar projects. We have larger hydropower and solar development projects in Southeast Asia, and hydropower projects, again, are not very, very uncontested, because there's always a big impact on local biodiversity. We have technical cooperation on energy efficiency and smart grids, countries like Indonesia and Uzbekistan. And I think their Korea is really, really strong. And so that's something very commendable, because we can here improve energy grids. We can get rid of energy losses, which makes their economy work better, and also gives them a better ecological balance. And finally, there's support for policy and planning through the GGGI, which is an international organization, but strongly linked still to Korean policies, and also UNDP partnership. So these smart power grids are one, like here in Tajikistan is an example, so as one of these projects. To improve electricity access, to reduce CO2 emissions, have local green jobs, policy impacts through training programs, and active alignments with SDG. Finally, coming to a conclusion, that's not so easy. Korea's clean energy policy is definitely still stronger in words than in deeds. It's very aligned with other policy goals, in particularly growth, but also, for example, geopolitics. We always see a lot of effort in countries which somehow Korea deems important for political reasons. For example, Mongolia, where they also have very interesting policies in afforestation, for example, biodiversity. So partner countries are strategically chosen. And as I said, Korea has a long tradition in benchmarking. My last remark, we still don't really know so much about climate change and biodiversity. Because I also work in biodiversity, I want to refer you to the previous presentation. There's just a new paper from University of Arizona, which claims that the mass extinction is really not happening, which we see. So the most important thing, I think, for climate change and also for discussing issues like biodiversity and climate change, it's to do more research. And I think Euraxis in all these three countries, and naturally also our European researchers, play a real important role there. And if there's any questions, I'm very happy to answer them in written form. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very informative presentation. Let me just say that mentioning the fruitful collaboration, prospective collaboration between Japan, China, Korea, and the European Union is something that we hope to achieve by featuring different projects in this webinar. Let me just introduce the next speaker in the meantime. Akira Sakano is Representative Director of Zero Waste Japan and also co-founder of Green Innovation. Furthermore, she is Director and Chief Sustainable Officer of Ecommit Ltd, and the title of her presentation is Sustainable Future and Zero Waste Policies. She is the founder and representative director of Zero Waste Japan and contributed to the building of the first zero waste town in Japan, Kamikatsu. She is now co-building the zero waste policies in various municipalities and local communities around Japan. She has also co-funded the Green Innovator Academy to foster more than 1,000 innovators in green transformation by 2030. She joined Ecommit Co. Ltd as Chief Sustainable Officer in 2023 to create infrastructure for the circular economy. She was the co-chair of the World Economic Forum annual meeting in 2019 and the Young Global Leaders class of 2025 by the World Economic Forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Akira Sakano, and I'm really happy to share my experience. So I myself has been working on the waste reduction or zero waste field for quite some time, and an advocate for the circular economy as well. I've been working with municipal government, local government, or local communities, and also pitched out exact examples or like the practices to the global or international society. So that's who I am. And then I've been working on waste, but why? Then why it's important, I'd like to share a little bit. So still, the waste is expected to increase and increase. Compared to 2016, by 2050, it's expected to increase by 70%. And of course, Asia is being the center for that. And then this is due to the increase for the population as well. Because with the population growth, we're going to consume more, we're going to then waste more. But the issue is there's no infrastructure ready yet for that amount of waste produced. That's why all this, ocean plastics, any kind of pollution is in the issue. But not only the waste management side, but also for the resource consumption side is an issue as well. We are consuming more amount or much faster then the Earth can recover. So basically, Earth overshoot day is around, in the middle of the year. So we are consuming the amount equivalent for the Earth can recover within 1 Earth in the middle of the year. So basically, we are consuming or we are already borrowing from our future generations. We only have only 1 Earth. Of course, there's no planet B, but we are consuming as if we have more Earth than, 1. So that's another side of the issue. Then this is in number. So basically every year we are consuming more and more. The consumption or extraction of raw resources is basically increasing every year. Meanwhile, the challenge is basically the recycling rate or circulating rate of the resources are getting lower and lower because we are not catching up for that infrastructure or system in the society. Then the typical example for that is the plastics. Basically, we started to consume plastic so sudden in so much amount so that the infrastructure again is not catching up. So that's why more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050 is what we are expecting to see in the future if we don't change the current situation. And then, of course, the production amount for the plastics is expected to increase more and more. Meanwhile, we are not catching up again for the recycling part of it. And then, of course, Asia being in very much of the center for that. That's why shifting towards circular economy is very much the key. But when we talk about circular economy, we always think about recycling, but it's not exactly the equal. So recycling itself is, of course, part of the solution, but it's not the ultimate or like holistic solution, I'd say. So circular economy is trying to achieve the society without losing, losing any value of existing resources within our society. So it's basically circulate again within the society. But for example, recycling, let's say one of the very good example for recyclable material is a paper. But after, let's say, 5 times or 6 times of recycling it, then, it gets too weak to be recycled again. So basically, recycling is not the answer always. So that's why transition to circular is very important. Of course, we already know that, we need to decouple our well-being versus, resource use amount, and then the environmental impact. And then when we talk about the climate change, of course, we need to reduce the GHG emission. Then normally we start talking about energy transition at the first place, which is very important. But at the same time, GHG emission is not only from the energy. So basically, almost half is, of course, coming from the energy. So by transitioning to the renewable energy, we can cut half. But the rest of the half is coming from production consumption. So which means the circular economy transition needs to come in hands as this states, right? Then this is the famous butterfly diagram by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to represent the circular economy model or the policy. Then basically, as you can see, as I mentioned, recycling is also part of it, but it's a bigger circle, right? Then what I can say from this diagram is that the smaller is actually better, right? So for recycling, I myself cannot do recycling by myself, right? So you need to hand it down to, or pass it on to someone who has the technology, and you need transportation. And then, it takes quite some time to make sure that it gets back to the raw material to be used. But for example, if you, let's say, give your clothes that you're not wearing that often these days to your friend, then that's, doesn't cost any energy. And then it doesn't, lower than any value of that product, right? So that kind of, simple example of like reusing or repairing or, smaller circle activity is actually very much valuable in the circular economy-based society. Then that's why I've been working with the local communities because they are the essential focus for that. So that's why as a Zero Waste Japan, which is my organization, has been working with municipal government, local communities, and local businesses or local stakeholders in various ways. Then typical example is the Kamikatsu town, which declared the first zero waste ambition in Japan back in 2003. Then actually, just to give an context in Japan, people often think that Japan is a clean society, you don't see trash in the road and so on. But actually, looking at the numbers, our recycling rate is quite low. So as you can see here, it's only 19%, 19 only. While we are practicing so much sorting, recycling is of course in the system, but it's not actually showing in the number. Why? Because we are quite locked in with the incinerator facilities across Japan. Yeah, I think still Japan ranks in the top in terms of the number of incinerator in the world, maybe. But anyway, we have very much many incinerators here in Japan. then that's why actually the society is based on that infrastructure, right? So if you see a waste bin or trash bin here in Japan, it's categorized based on is it burnable or non-burnable. But if you try to burn, most things can be burnt, right? So basically, this is a system design. But when we're trying to shift towards circular economy, you really need to think differently and then design differently, right? So that's why actually that first zero waste town called Kamikatsu, what they did was that, or what we did, was that looking at waste differently. So we started to think, okay, is it reusable or not? Or is it recyclable or not, right? Rather looking at, is it burnable? So that's how we redesigned everything. So we did various things, but basically by doing so, we could have achieved more than 80% of recycling rate versus our national average is below 20%. And then of course our reuse location, we have, a nice place people can bring in something they don't use anymore, and then you can take it away if you want it, right? So that place always had more than 90% of reusing rate within the community. At the same time, we don't even collect organic waste, so it gets composted at home 100%. Then, of course, we could achieve cost cutting for waste management cost. But what's more important was that actually the waste collection center itself, where people bring in their own waste from the household, became the community center because everyone produces waste anyway, right? So people actually bring waste to the waste collection center. So it gets to be the place that the most visited location ever in the community. So that's how waste facility is normally considered smelly, dirty, you don't want to go there. But it shifted towards, okay, it's the location you can actually meet other people, you can chat, you can actually exchange information. So that became the community center, and that was a huge transition. Then we could also engage like different stakeholders in the town. For example, grannies started doing upcycling craft shop and so on. So this kind of activity expand, right? So basically, environmental policy or waste management policy became more of the community revitalization policy. So that's how Kamikatsu became quite world famous in terms of the zero waste town or zero waste practices. We receive so many people, more than our population every year, to learn about zero waste practices in Kamikatsu. But at the same time, it was also a challenge, right? What we could have done is, for example, this Kurukuru shop is a reuse shop in Kamikatsu, and then there are quite several Kurukuru shop across Asia because people copied it. It was nice. Then I really value that. But actually, when we receive people from domestically, from Japan, people actually say this sentence. So this is great. Kamikatsu is doing great. But I think it was possible only because it was Kamikatsu. And then there's also a hidden sentence, following this, saying that I don't think I can do it back home. So I really wanted to change that situation. Then that's how I expanded our activities across Japan to work with various other municipalities, communities to bring in different zero waste practices. Then we actually has implemented zero waste policies across Japan in various communities. At the same time, we started working with different stakeholders, including businesses. For example, this is zero waste certification or accreditation system to certify back end or in the background effort of the local shops or the businesses who's trying to reduce waste production. And then we value their activities, right? So we could actually visualize them so that they can use that as a communication tool with their customers. Then for that certification system, we started to partner with international communities. Then one example is with South Korea. We started to partner with sustainability certification body in South Korea. And then we actually now do the exchange program for our knowledge, of course, but at the same time, we do exchange for the auditing system for our each certification system we have. So this is one way. At the same time, we started also coordinating with organization in Europe, which is called Mission Zero Academy, who does the certification for local municipal government. Then we really want to implement the certification system for the local government here in Japan as well. But we really need to customize, right? To do the customization, we again are trying to work with the South Korea organization so that we can kind of customize that for Asian context, and then we could implement in different ways here in the Asian region. So that's what we started to plan and what we started to work on right now. So we really expect for that kind of cross-regional or cross-country collaboration. Then when we look at the impact, actually, when we reflect ourselves what we are making in the impact in the society, especially in the environment, actually for the individual level, the highest impact for environmental impact reduction can be, as you can see, having one fewer child. This is very shocking, right? So that's how much human being ourselves are making impact in our environment, right? Then of course we cannot just say that, okay, we shouldn't have any human in the earth. So that's why we really need to shift our society in the systemic level. Then that's why while working still with the community or local organizations, I also have started working with the business sector more. So then I joined this venture called Ecomit, who does the collection, sorting, redistribution of secondhand or used items. Yeah. Then we also do the traceability by collecting data, reporting the environmental impact, and so on. Then we also partner with apparel or fashion industry. So we actually do the backside of these collection boxes in the shops or shopping malls, retail stores, or even at the post offices. Yeah. Then we actually do the resale or support their resale for that services. So for example, apparel store, they collect the items and then we do the back end sorting, and then we're gonna bring it back to their shop so that they can actually sell the same clothes twice, right? So originally, for example, the clothes is designed to be sold only once and then they can get the income only once. But if they are making sure that they can, collect it back and then they can sell it twice or three times, then of course the product design can be changed. So that's the kind of transition that we are eyeing to make sure that's going to happen in the society, because we really need to partner and change our production side. So that's how we are looking at the shift in the society. So as I mentioned, we are not living within the one Earth size of the resource consumption, but we really need to aim to make sure that we live within one Earth equivalent resource consumption. That's why, for example, we are, providing more accessibility for the consumers or customers to make sure that they can pass it down to someone else when they are trying to, get rid of their items. Or accessibility for the second-hand item is also important, right? And as I mentioned, for the producers, we partner with them to provide our data and then their infrastructure so that they can actually start doing the circularity within their businesses. So we are acting more like enablers. Then, of course, for that, we partner with various international stakeholders too. So for example, our customers for the second-hand sales is in the global network. We also partner with, for example, sorting or AI-driven facilities implementation project together with European companies as well. So these kind of, transition needs to happen everywhere, and we really need to share our knowledge in that context. Then for achieving any kind of project, I really value this concept of wind, water, soil. So basically, I might be acting now more like a wind person who brings more ideas, seeds to different organizations or different communities. Then we always need soil person in the ground who's acting sustainably, continue implementing the action. But we also need water person who's watering that seed to make sure it grows, right? So someone who can facilitate or coordinate the project in between ideas and then the actual action, right? So this kind of balance is what I value and what I try to create in different stakeholders. That's how we started, or how I started partnering with different stakeholders, different sectors. At the same time, now we are working from the perspective of course, from the local government, local community, but also with businesses, between the sectors within the businesses to make a coalition, which can make sure that the national level of the policy making can be influenced. So these are the way I'm approaching to the society right now. So thank you very much. If you're interested, please visit our website or also the Instagram, or you can also search Kamikatsu Zero Waste Japan on the YouTube as well. So thank you very much.
I would like to thank Ms. Sakano for the very informative, detailed presentation that also touched on collaboration with not only South Korea, but also Europe. Our closing speaker, Professor Naboisa Nakicenovic, is Vice Chair of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors at the European Commission. He is Honorary and Emeritus Scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis and Emeritus Professor of Energy Economics at the Vienna University of Technology. Further to that, he is outgoing Deputy Chair of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors at the European Commission and the Director of the World in 2050, Fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science, International Science Council, and the Luohan Academy, member of the Academia Europaea, the Montenegrin Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Earth League, and Ambassador of Earth Commission.
I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in the EuroAccess China, Japan, Korea event on sustainability and clean energy in international cooperation. And I'm very, very sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but I'm glad that I have a chance to say a few words. Well, let me first share some of the screen with you to illustrate my arguments about why clean energy and climate change are so important. Well, let me first say that that monumental, converging, and cascading challenges are facing humanity, from wars of unprecedented destruction, human suffering due to exclusion and increasing inequalities, economic crises, and geopolitical disruptions. But most importantly, in my view, in the long run, are the escalating pressure on the Earth system, and climate is central to that. And again, energy is central to climate. So let me just illustrate how we have changed the climate over the past 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That started pretty much 200 years ago in 1825 with the Stockton-Darlington railways that started this explosive development of the convergence of steam, steel, railways, textiles, and many other technologies that brought new institutional arrangements, new human behaviors, and so on. But unfortunately, one of the outcomes of that was also a 30-fold increase in the carbon dioxide emissions and the greenhouse gases that resulted in the change of the global mean temperature. And as you can see, during the 60s and 1970s, the change was not very large. On the left side, you see the global mean temperature expressed in degrees Celsius. But from the early 80s on, there was a drastic increase in the global mean temperature. And today, we are already at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level, which is the lower level of the Paris Agreement. And science has been quite clear about that already 50 years ago. And as a result, we had the IPCC created, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and so on. But unfortunately, nature has not noticed any of our efforts. In fact, as you can see in the tiny little red curve, during the last decades or so, we are increasing above that trend. So the global warming is accelerating. And if we look forward into the future, we can see that we are bound to also, with very high likelihood, exceed also 2 degrees Celsius in a few decades from now. And that is the upper level of the Paris Agreement. And we will be entering a phase of what is called overshoot over the Paris agreements. So for that reason, mitigation, reduction of emissions to net zero is an absolute must, but also adaptation, because we will be experiencing even more dangerous climate change than today. And we might require negative emissions, hopefully through nature-based solutions, but perhaps also direct capture of carbon from the atmosphere in order to return to the levels that are not so dangerous as specified in the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's our challenge, is how to manage the overshoot and make sure we go down to net zero as soon as possible, because for any level of stabilization of the climate, net zero emissions need to be increased, because there is in the first approximation, a direct relationship between cumulative emissions and the temperature change. So what needs to be done? Well, first, let me just show you the current emissions in billion tons of CO2 or gigatons. We emit today about 40 billion tons, but to achieve the stabilization, as I mentioned before, achieving net zero is a must. We have called that in a 1917 publication in Science the carbon law. Basically, that we need to halve the emissions every decade to approach net zero by the middle of the next century. The reason for that is also that currently the biosphere, the carbon sinks of the planet, are very kind to humanity. They remove about half of our emissions, but this is weakening with the climate change and other ecological changes in the Earth system, and this is why we will need the carbon sinks, as I mentioned before, shown here in orange and yellow. So it's a threefold challenge. We must reduce the emissions, we must find a way of generating sinks, and make sure that we do not endanger further degradation of the natural carbon cycle that removes part of our emissions. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means we must immediately redirect investments from fossil fuels to low carbon and efficiency solutions. That means the decarbonization of the power sector, of the energy sector, electrification of all end uses. End use is really essential in energy, efficiency improvements, and also treatment of the natural forestry and agriculture. So we need to achieve carbon neutral economy by the middle of the century, zero carbon electricity, electrified end uses I mentioned before, low and zero carbon fuels, and carbon removal from the atmosphere, including nature-based solutions such as afforestation. But there are also very difficult sectors to decarbonize, such as aviation, heavy industry, and agriculture. But at the end of the day, net negative emissions will be required, as I mentioned before. So that's the challenge ahead of us. And much of this transformation toward a sustainable future for all is anchored in the European Green Deal, that is basically that is an European interpretation of the 2030 agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And as a result of that, Europe has committed itself to reduce the emissions by 55% by 2030, minus 55, and to reduce the emissions by 90% by 2040 and achieve net zero by the middle of the century. So this is perfectly consistent with the science, and hopefully there will not be delays in achieving these goals. And I had the pleasure of serving during the last 5 years in the group of chief scientific advisors, and we have provided many advisory functions to the European Commission, for example, on healthy food, but on climate issues, but also on climate, on energy. Basically, the scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission consists of three groups. There is this group of chief scientific advisors, but there is also SAPEA, a consortium of European academies that provides kind of assessment reports. They're called evidence review reports, and there is also a secretariat in the Commission. And based on that, the group of chief scientific advisors provides a policy advice, policy recommendations to the Commission. We have rotated off, and there is now a new group of 7 chief scientific advisors. So let me just share with you briefly the recommendations in the last policy advice on climate, in which I participated end of last year. Where our first recommendation and foremost recommendation was that the Commission and the world should reduce greenhouse gas emissions as the main solution to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, and that the goals that the Commission has, like Fit for 55, 90%, and net zero by 2050, are the best ways to do that. So we have recommended to continue to treat emission reductions and adaptation, because we are entering in the dangerous area of climate change, should be the highest priority, and also to minimize what I mentioned before, the overshoot and its possible adverse effect. And this is why adaptation is so important. So the solutions are known, as I mentioned before: efficiency improvements and replacement of fossil fuels to carbon-free energy, mitigation of land use emissions and enhancing its sinks. These are nature-based solutions, but also carbon capture from fossil fuels might be required to go rapidly down to net zero, and eventually perhaps even carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So in that sense, our main recommendation was to continue to actively and vigorously invest in research and on deployment of climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, this will require radical changes, and I wanted to illustrate to you that humanity has been capable of achieving such disruptive changes of relatively short time scale. Here, I think these two pictures illustrate this really, really amply. On the left, you see the Easter parade on the Fifth Avenue in New York City. There is one car there. Perhaps you can spot it. Otherwise, basically just horses and carriages. But on the right, 13 years later, mostly motor vehicles. The replacement, but this is New York City, the replacement in U.S. altogether took about 30 years before the horses disappeared from the American roads, and that was true in Great Britain, across most Europe, and also in the global South with some delay. So it shows that in 30 years, this kind of granular, small-scale technologies, even though they require infrastructures, can change our system. So if you think about the electric vehicles as the way toward net zero and toward the electrification of energy end uses, so 30 years might be a conceivable time frame over which that can be received. But there are also other granular systems that have provided this kind of disruptive change. So what you see here, I would like to just briefly illustrate that. What you see here in the middle are some of the digital and analog devices that we use for telecommunication, that together would use about 450 watts of energy and 72 watts of standby energy. But 30 years ago, digital telephone was introduced, and today a smartphone uses only 5 watts, 1/100th of the energy that the devices that it replaces need, and on top of it provides many, many services. And the diffusion lasted 30 years, and today essentially everybody in the world, unfortunately even people who do not have access to electricity, some 500 million to 1 billion people who can't afford electricity, also have a mobile phone. And the other advantage is also a 20-fold reduction in the embedded energy that you need to produce mobile phones, and the needed materials. So it shows that the digital revolution can perhaps bring what we need in order to achieve safe and just future for all. Another illustration of a granular technology are the photovoltaic cells. On the vertical scale, you see an index of costs, say dollars per kilowatt hour of photovoltaic cells, and on the horizontal scale, the number of doubling of the global capacity. And this has been exceedingly successful. Per doubling of the global, each doubling of the global capacity has brought about 20% reduction in costs. So today, photovoltaics are among the cheapest ways to produce the electricity. In contrast to that, some of the more large-scale technologies, because of all of the complexities involved, have not always achieved such huge cost reductions as the more granular technologies, in particular those ones that are close to the end user. So a possible big change of improving the efficiencies of energy and thereby going toward zero carbon and therefore also reducing the climate change could involve many of the changes that we already see today. I would just like to highlight three of them: a shift from ownership to usership, such as car share, bike share, and so on, but also shared economy in general. Provides huge opportunities for reduction of both energy needs and emissions while providing more services. And last but not least, perhaps most important, are the integrated systems, going from automized to connected, such as peer-to-peer communications, integrating the systems, and that might bring the needed transformation to avoid most dangerous climate change and also achieve prosperity for all. Let me just close my brief presentation by showing you that that has actually occurred in the history in the rhythm of about 50 years. As you can see on top, railways, then flying machines, communication, individual mobility, and at the bottom, industrial processes. They have fundamentally changed every 50 years. But not only that, what is important is the vertical, that they created systems that are connected. And so hopefully by 2050, we will have close to net zero emissions in the world through some of the technologies. I, of course, don't have a crystal ball, and none of us know what will happen in the future. These are just some illustrative examples of how net zero energy system might look like in the future. Thank you very much.
And with that, we would like to thank you for your time, for being with us today. And we hope that you have some very useful information as a takeaway. Should you have any queries, please send us an email. The Japan email address is japan@euraccess.net. And it's the same for my colleagues, I believe, Tomasz, Carlos.
Korea@euraccess.net.
And China@euraccess.net.
Thank you for coming today. Please follow us on X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and check out our portals every now and then. You can become a member free of charge of any of our EURAccess hubs. And we are looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.